Will you ever be truly satisfied? The Buddha's promise of Nibbana. We go through life propelled by our desires. Sometimes we get what we want and we're satisfied for a while, and then we're not so satisfied, so we generate more desires. We take it for granted that that's simply the way things have to be. Some of us think that, well, maybe if we get a lot of things, they'll make up for the lack of other things. So people amass things, amass power, amass wealth, thinking that a little wealth didn't satisfy, but maybe a lot of wealth will. Or a few things didn't satisfy, but maybe a lot will. Or one partner didn't satisfy, so maybe a lot of partners will. But that wasn't the Buddha's approach. He wanted to find something that left no need for further desire. But then he also discovered that he really had to desire it to find it. There's a passage where, after he gained his awakening, he said, "All things are rooted in desire." Thing. The word here is dhammas, and that can mean both good and bad phenomena. Everything you experience, he said, is rooted in desire someplace. After all, when you see, hear, smell, taste, touch, and think about things, you're not simply a passive recipient. You're out there looking for things to sense, looking for pleasures, looking for some satisfaction. That active side is rooted in desire. But then Nibbana, the Buddha said, is the ending of all dhammas. It's the one thing that's not rooted in desire. But to get there requires desire. This is why desire is one of the bases for success. The image that Venananda gives is of going to a park. To get there, you first need to have the desire to go, seeing that it's worth the effort. But then when you get to the park, the desire's gone. Now imagine a park that would be so totally satisfactory you wouldn't desire anything else in life. That would be Nibbana. But such a satisfaction seems so far away and so improbable, and the path seems so hard that we find ourselves saying, well, maybe I'll put up with X or put up with Y, and that'll be good enough for me. In this way, we sell ourselves short. We have the potential to find something that puts us beyond the need for desire, and yet we go around desiring and looking for other things. The Buddha called those other things the objects of an ignoble search. The noble search is the search for what's deathless. So you have to ask yourself, how much do you want it? This is where motivation comes in. The Buddha focused on heedfulness as an ideal kind of motivation, one who sees danger and respects being heedful, as in the chant just now. The phrase, seeing danger, is one of those fanciful etymologies that come from the commentary. They take the word bhikkhu, monk, and they cut it into 2 syllables, and they decide, from the meaning of each syllable, that it means one who sees danger. It's fanciful, but it is appropriate as an educational etymology. In other words, an explanation that tries to get a fruitful meaning out of the word regardless of whether it's etymologically true. When you hear the word bhikkhu, it's useful to think someone who sees danger, because that's precisely what the Buddha was, someone who saw danger. He had all kinds of wealth, all kinds of sensual pleasures, the potential for all kinds of power, but he saw danger in all these things. You get used to them, and you're going to lose them, so you fight to save them. But then you lose them anyhow. And what happens then? You fall. And you don't just suffer when you fall, you take out your suffering on others, which will make you fall even further. Seeing the danger in that, he said, I've got to find something else. So when you look at your own desires of what you want in life, ask yourself, do you see danger in what you desire? This evening I was reading a passage by Ajahn Chah, where he said, when he ordained first as a novice, he didn't see any danger in life. He didn't really understand what ordaining was all about. But then, as he became a monk and started studying, he began to realize that there's danger in all kinds of things, especially the things that are really attractive. He said it was like seeing the best kind of banana they have in Thailand, Kluai Namwa, but realizing that there's poison in it. No matter how much you like that particular kind of banana, knowing that there's poison there, you avoid it. So when you find yourself wanting something that's going to let you down, remind yourself of the poison. The same if you find yourself indulging in some sort of addictive behavior, whether it's substance abuse or emotion abuse. In other words, letting yourself stew in emotions that are really not productive, but you get some sort of satisfaction out of them, self-pity, resentment, or whatever it may be. Look for the poison and then remind yourself that it is possible to get past that. It is possible to get the mind in a state where it doesn't like that anymore, doesn't need it anymore, and try to cultivate a desire for a safe place. As the Buddha says, see renunciation as rest. See that by letting go of the things that you've been thirsting for and craving for, there's a greater sense of well-being and security. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that you give up all desires. You have to desire that state of well-being, but you have to approach it wisely. How do you get there? Focus on the causes and see the path as something doable. You might tell yourself, I can't manage this path. I won't be able to get to the end. But think about this. When you develop the path, you're going to change as a person. The path will turn you into someone who is capable of reaching that goal. So try to put that fact in your mental calculation. As for the part of the mind that asks, this particular course of action, is it worthwhile or not? Tell yourself that it may require a lot of effort, but if it repays really well, maybe it's worth doing. And if you tell yourself, I don't have the energy to put all that effort in, well, that's one of the reasons we practice the path, because it gives you more energy as you develop it. So do your best to remind yourself that this is a really worthwhile goal, something that lies beyond anything in our culture. Because that's another big problem in our culture, thinking that there's nothing to us aside from how we've been shaped by our culture. We live in a land of wrong view that tells us that this kind of path isn't worth it, that it's not really real, or that people who follow it are losers or deluded. And the media is so oppressive these days. People carry a little bit of the media around in their pockets and subject themselves to it constantly. As Ajahn Fuang used to say, people in general are disturbed by people who are more heedful than they are. They don't want to be told that there are dangers where they're finding pleasure, so they're going to dismiss you. You have to ask yourself, am I going to allow myself to be blinded by their blindness? You have to wish them well, but you also have to say, I have to resist that particular influence. And it's not just a matter of living in a country that hasn't been shaped by Buddhism. Even in Asia, where there are countries shaped by Buddhism, people who practice have a hard time getting their families and friends to see that it's a good thing. They say, do a moderate amount of practice, which is the middle way of the defilements. They say, well, do it a little bit, but don't take it too seriously. So the practice is always going to be countercultural. This is why, as Ajahn Mun said, you have to replace the culture you were raised in with the culture of the noble ones. This is what everybody in the practice has to do, to adopt new values, to adopt a new vision of what is possible in life. It's through thinking in these ways that the desire to follow the path can get you on the right track. After all, the path, like everything else, is rooted in desire, and you have to keep nurturing that desire. And although we have Dhamma talks and books and everything to help you, you're the one who has to read them and apply them and say, this really does apply to me, and I really do want it. Think of the Buddha. He wanted this really strongly. He wanted it so strongly that he was willing to try anything, even 6 years of self-torture. Fortunately, we don't have to follow that particular path, but you're not going to get rid of the need for desire just by telling yourself, well, I'm just going to stop desiring. You have to focus your desire on the right place, on the causes that lead to a result that's really satisfactory. The end of desire is not simply a decision to stop desiring, or to give up or be apathetic. The end of desire is reaching something so totally satisfactory that you don't need to desire anything else. That's the success to which these bases of success are aimed. All things are rooted in desire. That's what the Buddha said. Sometimes, Buddhism is characterized as not appreciating how important desire is. But this statement shows that the Buddha realized that this is what we are. We come from desire. We're born because of desire and craving. He says that without the craving, a being wouldn't be able to make it from one life to the next. The being itself is defined by its desires, by its attachments. In other words, we define ourselves by what we want. What this means, of course, is that we're also defined by our frustrations. All too often, our wants get frustrated. Either we don't get what we want, or when we get it, we find that it's something different from what we thought it was. Or it seems to be what we thought was, but it doesn't last. All of which is frustrating. So the Buddha said that the only way out is to go beyond desire. But desire is not something you can simply drop. You have to learn how to refine it, take it apart. The first step is realizing that desires are not just one thing. There are lots of desires for lots of different things. You hear people talking about desire as a single cosmic force. You hear them telling you that what you really want in life is wholeness, or completeness, or to be fully in the present moment, or whatever. Those are actually many things that you might want. They're not the one thing that every desire is aiming at. You have an itch and you scratch it. You have a hunger and you try to assuage it. All desires aim at happiness and well-being, but each desire differs based on its object, based on where it's coming from and where it's headed. The Buddha has you start out by looking at the different places where desires go. Some go to relative happiness and ease, others get frustrated, and some are actually destructive. So you start out by learning how to let go of your destructive desires, seeing that they really don't lead to any kind of happiness at all, and instead lead to a lot of pain and misery. When you live a life of generosity and virtue, you find it really does make a big difference letting go of those unskillful desires. Then you start applying the same principle to the mind. This is why we meditate. Right effort is the first factor of the path that deals with meditation. It's a factor of desire. It's about generating desire to let go of unskillful states that have arisen, to prevent unskillful states that haven't arisen from coming into being, generating desire to give rise to skillful mental states, and to develop them when they have arisen. What you're doing is that you're taming desire. You're learning to direct your desires in the right direction, as when you're sitting here right now. Thoughts may be wandering off, but the mind doesn't have to wander after them. They may want this, they may want that. After all, one of the major hindrances is sensual desire, but you learn to say no. In the beginning, with the precepts, you learn that you may have an unskillful desire, but you simply don't give in to it. You say no to the activity. The desire may be raging in the mind, but you keep saying, "No, I'm not going to go there." One of the principles of the practice is that you learn an awful lot by restraining your desires. People who simply follow their desires and don't have any kind of restraint at all don't learn very much in life. You read about the divas in the canon, and often they're pretty dumb. Things are easy for them. They don't have to reflect very much. Then Jesse was telling us one time about the time when he was working as a model and he found himself among all these really good-looking people trying out for commercials. He tried to talk to them about serious things, but he said there wasn't much there. They weren't very reflective people. Things were going easy for them. On the other hand, you find people who do have their desires frustrated in many ways, but they often don't learn much from them. either. Psychologists have done studies of people pursuing things in life, and often they're things they pursued before, they've tried them out, and they didn't get any real satisfaction, but then they turn around and pursue them again. So it's not simply that frustration teaches you lessons. What you need is the willingness to learn, realizing that something's got to change. So the Buddha gives you, on the one hand, instructions on how to develop a sense of well-being that will enable you not be so hungry for certain desires, and on the other, tools for looking at the desire through restraint. When you say no to desire, how do you look at it in such way that you learn from it? That's one of the most important tools for the path. This is why virtue and concentration have to go together. When you gain a sense of well-being from the pleasure that comes from concentration, which the Buddha said is a blameless pleasure, then you turn around and look at the other pleasures you've been pursuing, and you find it a lot easier to see the drawbacks in a more objective way. If you're simply hungering for them and don't see any alternative to the pleasure they give, you're going to keep rushing after them. But when you see the alternative that comes from concentration when the mind gets still, and that stillness doesn't have to depend on things outside, that puts you in a better position for understanding what the desire is all about, exactly where it comes from, whether it's something that's really worth identifying with or not. This is where it gets interesting, because as I said earlier, you're defined by your desires. Now you begin to let go of some of the things you've used to define yourself. Some people feel threatened by this. Again, here's another area where concentration is helpful. It's a lot easier to let go of things when you're feeling good, when you're feeling settled, when you're feeling whole as you're doing the concentration, than it is when you're feeling hungry and desperate. Up to this point, it's simply a question of what you're choosing to identify with. The Buddha keeps giving you better and better and better things to identify with. He tells you, when there's a perception in mind that allows for stillness, you try to settle the mind and make it stable, make it confident in that perception. The more solidly you can develop concentration, the easier it is to let go of other things. If the concentration is still wobbly, you're half holding on to the concentration and half holding on to everything else in your life, because the concentration hasn't yet provided you with any sense of security that seems special, seems more reliable than the pleasure you get from outside. That's why mastering concentration is so important in the practice. Once you've developed it as a skill, then you can start getting into the more interesting aspects of learning how to let go of your more refined attachments. This is why the pursuit of true happiness asks the question of you. Are you going to hold on to the way you've been defining yourself, or are you going to go for true happiness? A lot of people stop right there. They say, "My desires are me. How can I let them go? It would be like letting go of myself." And the Buddha says, precisely the point. But if you can learn to see your sense of self as a strategy, you realize that you came up with the whole idea of self to begin with as a way of organizing your experience so as to maximize happiness. It's simply a matter that you've now run into the limitations of that particular strategy. You can see the limitation that comes from defining yourself in terms of feelings or perceptions, thought constructs, consciousness, when they finally do start appearing to be burdensome. This requires a fair amount of sensitizing the mind, because otherwise you're willing to put up with all kinds of burdens. You think, well, this is as good as it gets. But as you get more and more sensitized through the concentration practice and your sensitivities get more refined, you begin to see, yeah, this is a burdensome. This need to keep identifying myself, to say, this is this, and that's that, and I'm this, and this is mine. You learn to let go in stages. As Ajahn Suwat used to say, once there's the experience of ultimate happiness, who cares what's experiencing it? You certainly don't care. At that point, you give up desire not simply to be very stoic, but because you've reached a point where desire is no longer needed. You've got the ultimate happiness. What other need would there be for desire? This is why there's that passage where the Buddha says that you can't talk about what the arahants are like, whether the arahant exists after death or doesn't exist, or both or neither, because you can't even define the arahant. You can't even define the Buddha in the present lifetime. There's that passage with Ven, Anuradha, where the Buddha chases him down a long list of questions. How can you talk about the Buddha after death when you can't even define him in the present life? You can't define him in terms of the khandhas. You can't define them as something that's not the khandhas, because how would you define that? He goes through all the different contorted ways that you could use the khandhas to define him, and you can't do it, because he doesn't have any desire. He doesn't have any attachment for those things. He's undefined. This doesn't mean he doesn't function. He functions perfectly well. In one of the suttas, the Buddha talks about his attitude toward teaching, saying that he teaches people with the purpose of getting them to practice so that they can gain awakening. If they do put his teachings into practice and they do gain awakening, he's gratified by that, but he doesn't let the gratification overcome his mind. That's because he doesn't identify with it. When his listeners don't follow his words, he doesn't let any disappointment overcome his mind. He can still function. He can see that one result is better than the other, but in terms of the results of his actions, he just lets them go. Sometimes we're told to clone that attitude as we practice. Practice, but don't be attached to the results of your practice. Well, that works only when you've achieved full happiness. That's when you can relate to the world in that way. Prior to that, though, you've got to have your attachments. You've got to have your desires. You can't pretend that you don't. Otherwise, you start lying to yourself. What you want to do in the practice is learn how to really look truthfully and seriously at your desires, to see how much happiness they actually give you. You really want to be happy, but then you test the object you've been desiring for, you test the desire itself, and you see where they're lacking. In that way, you learn from them. You learn to be more and more skillful in your desires, to focus them more precisely in places where they really do benefit you. Again, there's a strong desire, a strong wanting in this, but it's tempered by the knowledge that you've got to learn how to give up a lot of things that you may have been holding on to very tightly. But when you see the benefits that come from letting go, it gets a lot easier. So you treat desire not as a big monolithic thing, but as desires, individual events in the mind, and you gauge them by what they do for you. That way, the direction of your desires gets more and more oriented toward the point where you really can finally open up and reach a happiness that's totally gratifying, to the point where you're no longer a slave to these things, these likes and dislikes, these desires. You don't need them anymore. So desire is an important element in the path. A lot of our training is turning desire from being part of the second noble truth into being part of the fourth noble truth, learning how to let go of the desires that are the second noble truth and how to encourage the ones that are part of the fourth. We're willing to take those skillful desires and see how far they go, even to the extent of letting go of our sense of who we are. But the rewards are more than worth it. The desire to end all desires. A while back, I saw a video where a Buddhist teacher was being interviewed, and she was saying that the purpose of the practice is to realize there's nothing to be gained beyond what you have right now. So, learn how simply to accept what is right now, and you'll be okay. The interviewer asked her, "Isn't that defeatist?" And the teacher said, "Only if you think about it, which is a horrible way to live, not being able to think. And when you do think, you're thinking that there's nothing better than what you've got right now. It is a defeatist way of thinking." The Buddha was anything but defeatist. Think about it. He gave 6 years of his life to austerities, trying to find a way to happiness. That didn't work, so he tried other things. Finally, he came across the path. If he had simply accepted the way things were, he wouldn't even have left his home. he just would have stayed where he was, accepting the fact that all of his happiness, all of his pleasures were going to have to die, and somehow making himself okay with that. But he refused. As he said later, discontent was one of the secrets to his awakening. But it wasn't just a general discontent. It was discontent with the skillfulness of his own actions, realizing that the problem in life, the fact that he wasn't gaining happiness, could not be blamed on things outside. It had to be blamed on his own actions. But actions are things that can be changed, which is what he tried to do. Where do you start when you change your actions? You start with your mind because your mind is what's making the decisions. This is why, when we meditate, we focus on the mind in the present moment. Now, you can't focus directly on the mind as you start out, so you focus on something that's really close, the breath. You do what you can to get the mind to stay with the breath. Sometimes you need to use a meditation word. Sometimes you use counting. Ajahn Lee has an interesting method of counting. He says you start counting the breaths 1 through 10, and then 1 through 9, 1 through 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. By that time, the mind should be settled down, so you stay with 0. No more counting. If it's not settled down, you start with 10 again. The point is that you do what you can to get the mind to settle down. He also recommends making the breath as comfortable as possible. Find what rhythm of breathing feels good, in long, out long, or in long, out short, in short, out long, or in short, out short. And that's just the beginning. You can also try heavy or light, fast or slow, deep or shallow. There's a lot to experiment with. The purpose of the experiment, of course, is to try to find what helps the mind to settle down. The desire for concentration is not a bad thing. We chanted just now on the factor of right effort, generating desire to give rise to what is skillful, and generating desire to maintain what is skillful and have it develop. This is all part of the path. When the Buddha said that craving was the cause of suffering, many people think that he meant all kinds of craving and all kinds of desire are bad, but that's not what he said. He specified 3 kinds of craving as causing suffering. But he also assigned the desire to be skillful and the desire to avoid unskillful behavior to the factor of right effort in the path. There's a passage where Ananda is being questioned by a Brahmin. The Brahmin has come to see Ananda in the park where he's staying and asks him, "What is the purpose of this path you follow?" And Ananda says, "One of the purposes is to put an end to desire." The Brahmin asks, "How do you do that?" Then Ananda explains a set of teachings that are called the bases for success: concentration based on desire, concentration based on persistence, concentration based on intent, and concentration based on your powers of analysis. The Brahmin says, "That's impossible. How can you use desire to get rid of desire?" And Ananda asks him, "Before you came to the park, did you have desire to come to the park?" "Well, yes. Now that you're here, where is the desire? It's gone." In the same way, you use desire to put an end to desire, if you do it right. And that qualification, if you do it right, is important because, actually, all things we experience are rooted in desire. The mind is a desiring thing. It has a purpose. The problem is that it has many purposes. Sometimes they're at cross purposes with one another, and sometimes they're aimed at the wrong things. So the Buddha's not saying that you abandon desire. He's simply saying, learn how to direct it. In that list of the bases of success, concentration based on desire, based on persistence, based on intent, and based on your powers of analysis, the first 3 kinds of concentration are really one. After all, right effort consists of desire, persistence, and intent. All of them have to be present for concentration to happen. It's simply a matter of which one is predominant. And so your desire should be focused on the persistence. In other words, focused on doing things. All too often, one of the reasons we don't get where we want in the meditation is because we focus our thoughts too much on where we want to go, and not on what we have to do to get there. We sit here thinking about how much we want the mind to be quiet. If it's not quiet, we get frustrated. But you have to realize that the fact that you have to want to get it quiet means that it's not quiet to begin with. So you learn how to focus on the breath even when the mind isn't quiet. There may be thoughts running around through the mind on many different levels, but you make up your mind to stay with the breath regardless of those other thoughts, and you pay them no attention. You don't have to snuff them out. You don't have to chase them down and kill them. You just don't pay them any attention. It's like someone over in the other corner of the room talking while you've got work to do in this corner of the room. If you spend all your time thinking about how you don't want them to be talking, you're never going to get your work done. You focus your attention on your work and don't pay them any mind. Your work gets done. So it's a matter of learning how to focus your desires in the right place, on the right actions. Focus your desire on really being intent on what you're doing, paying careful attention. When people get bored with their concentration, it's because they're not paying careful attention. Everything you need to know for awakening, everything you need to know for ultimate happiness is happening right here. How can it be boring? It's simply that you're not paying careful enough attention to what you're doing that gets in the way of happiness. Then finally, there's concentration based on your powers of analysis. Even that is in right effort, because for the mind to settle down, you have to be able to distinguish between what's skillful and what's not. And here, you have to figure out, when the mind doesn't settle down, what are you doing wrong? What can you change? This is how the Buddha himself gained awakening. He didn't have any guide to teach him. It was simply that, as he said, he would maintain his attitude of discontent with his level of skill. If he hadn't yet reached the end of suffering, he'd have to keep developing more skill until he did. So, how do you develop that discontent until you reach a level of skill that should truly make you content? You observe what you're doing, seeing what you're doing wrong, and asking yourself, is there some other way of doing it? For instance, if you're focused on the breath in the nose and you don't seem to be getting anywhere, change the point of your focus. Or you can look at the way you perceive the breath. What image do you have in your mind when you think about breath? For most of us, the first thing we think about is the air coming in and out through the nose. But the Buddha talks about what they call wind energy in the different parts of the body. In Thai, the word for wind and breath is the same. So they talk about breath energies in the body. You find this also in Sanskrit. Prana is breath, which is close to Appamada, the Pali word for breathing. And as they say, prana runs throughout the body. So relate your in and out breath to the breath throughout the body, the sense of energy throughout the body, the flow of energy throughout the body. And try to develop a whole body awareness. Ask yourself, within the context of that whole body awareness, what kind of breathing feels good? When the breathing feels good, can you make that breath or that sense of feeling good spread through the body so that you feel like you're being bathed in breath energy? Change the image of your relationship to the breath. You're not in one part of the body looking at the breath someplace else. You're allowing yourself to be bathed all around by breath energy. What kind of breath energy would feel good that way? Use your ingenuity. After all, this is how Ajahn Lee found this method. He was stuck off in the forest. He'd walked into a place in the forest and was going to spend the rain's retreat there. 3 days it took him to walk there, and soon after he arrived, he had a heart attack. There were no medicines around, no doctors. If he was going to get out of there alive, he was going to have to walk out. The food wasn't good. So what did he have? He had his breath. So he figured out how to breathe in a way that would help him recover from his heart attack. It involved breathing and working with the breath energies throughout the body. His ingenuity was what saved his life and helped him find a really useful way of meditating and teaching meditation. So use your ingenuity as well. Meditation is an active process, which means that you have to actively get involved in what you're doing so that you can see clearly what you're doing. This is why we get the mind into concentration, so that we can see our actions as they're happening. We see what lies behind them, what motivates them, and we see where they lead. It's in this way that we develop skill and can bring the level of our skill to a place where we can properly be content with it. As Ananda said, the point here is ultimately to get to a point where you don't have to have any desires. It's not as if you're snuffing out your desires. You're taking yourself to a place where there's no need for desire. The happiness you found is that satisfactory. But to get there, don't simply let yourself be satisfied with the way things are. Learn how to be content with things outside that you can't change, where the situation is good enough to practice. But don't rest content with the level of skill you've developed. Always keep looking for ways to make it better, better, better. When you focus your desire there, it becomes an integral part of getting to the point where you don't need desire anymore.